All right, let's just jump right in. What if I told you that your identity, who you are, isn't something you just have? What if it's something you're actively becoming every single day? We're about to dive into a really radical idea here, one that totally flips the script on centuries of Western thought about what it even means to be human. So yeah, let's get into it.
So, this is the big question we're wrestling with today. For most of history, we've kind of been told that there's this stable, essential me at our core, right? A fixed self. But what if that's not true? What if that very belief, that idea of a fixed self, has actually been holding us back from our true potential all along?
Okay, so to really get our heads around this new idea, we first have to look back at the old one. And here's the thing. According to the philosopher Sergey Khoruzhiy, the classical Western model of what humanity is, well, it created a huge problem. He says it led to a forgetting of man, a forgetting of the real, living, breathing person in all their complexity.
So, this classical model wasn't built overnight. You can think of it in stages, really. First, you had Aristotle, who gave us this idea of a fixed human essence. Then, a few centuries later, along comes Descartes, and he gives us the subject, that thinking I at the center of everything. And then finally, Kant comes along and defines humanity through these big, abstract, universal principles. So what's the end result of all this? Well, the human being kind of became a generic concept, right? Not a unique, living, breathing individual.
And this really lays out two fundamentally different ways of looking at us. On the one hand, you have the classical model, which is totally static. It's all about a fixed substance or essence. But on the other hand, this alternative view we're exploring today, it sees a person as dynamic. You're not defined by what you are, but by what you do. It's all about your energy, your experiences, your practices.
Now, of course, this classical model didn't just sail through history unchallenged. Oh no. Thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard, they pushed back, and they pushed back hard. Khoruzhiy calls it a loud anthropological protest. Kierkegaard was basically screaming from the rooftops that philosophy and theology had completely forgotten about the single, unique individual, with all their messy feelings and their real-world struggles.
This protest, this loud cry for the individual, it sparked a huge shift. Fast forward to the 20th century, and you get what's now called the anthropological turn. Thinkers basically made a conscious decision to bring their work back down to earth. The whole point was to refocus on the real, lived human experience and to try and recover what they felt had been lost for centuries.
So where did they look for answers? Well, for a particular group of Orthodox Christian thinkers, this search for a new way to understand humanity led them somewhere really old. And for a lot of people, a pretty unexpected place, an ancient spiritual tradition.
That tradition is called Hesychasm, and right away it highlights a super important difference. Here's a good way to think about it. Hesychasm isn't about changing the hardware of who you are, your so-called essence. No, it's about changing the software. It's about transforming your energies, all those dynamic forces that you express out in the world.
And what's the end goal of all this? It's a concept called theosis. Basically, it's the idea that a person can, by transforming their own energies, totally transcend their normal state of being and actually participate in a higher reality. It's a really powerful, historical example of an entire worldview that's built on experience, not just on abstract ideas.
Okay, so the big question is, how is this kind of radical transformation even possible? Well, the Hesychast tradition discovered a core mechanism. You could almost call it an engine for human change. And they had a name for it, synergy.
Synergy, it all comes down to collaboration. It's that moment, that connection point, where our own human energies link up and start working with an energy that's beyond ourselves. And according to this whole tradition, that powerful cooperation, that's the key. That's what unlocks our potential for real, lasting transformation.
You can actually picture this journey like a ladder. The first step is called praxis. That's the hard work, right? The self-purification, the discipline. But the key, the most crucial middle rung on that ladder is synergy. It's the big breakthrough. It's what allows you to climb from just doing the practice into theoria, which is true contemplation, and finally access those higher states of being.
And this all brings us to a really beautiful and powerful metaphor for this whole process, the open palm. I mean, just think about it. It's a gesture of receiving, of collaboration, of synergy. It perfectly represents this idea of the unlocking of man. The idea that we aren't these closed-off, finished things. We're beings who are capable of opening ourselves up to a much greater energy and potential.
Okay, so here's where things take a really big leap. Sergey Khoruzhiy takes this ancient theological concept of synergy and he blows it up. He proposes it as something much bigger. a universal model for understanding every human being, no matter what they believe. He calls his idea Synergetic Anthropology, and it is a direct challenge to that old way of thinking, what he calls the anthropology of the center, the one that's always looking for some fixed, static core inside of us. Instead, Khoruzhiy says we should be thinking in terms of an anthropology of the border. And what does that mean? It means we should focus on the dynamic potential we have, right at the very limits of our experience.
So what is this anthropological border? What does he actually mean? Well, a great way to think of it is as the edge of your comfort zone, but like on a massive scale. It's that place where you push yourself to your absolute limit, and in doing so, you encounter something other than your normal everyday self. This is the space where real transformation, that unlocking we've been talking about, can actually happen.
But it gets even more interesting. Khoruzhiy then decides to map this border, and he realizes it's not just one big uniform thing. Instead, he identifies 3 totally distinct regions. He calls them areals on this border, and each one corresponds to a fundamentally different way of being human. Okay, first on the map is what Khoruzhiy calls ontological man. For this person, the journey is directed outward and upward. They use spiritual practices to push themselves to that border where they can interact with a transcendent other. You could call it God or the universe or being itself. For them, transformation comes from connecting to that higher reality.
Next up, we have onticable man. Now, if the first journey was upward, this one is inward. This person finds their border deep inside their own mind. The practice here might be something like psychoanalysis, and the other they encounter at that border is their own unconscious. So for them, the unlocking happens by exploring the hidden depths of the self.
And finally, there's a third type, and this one is uniquely modern, virtual man. As you can probably guess, this person's journey is into the digital world. Through virtual practices, fully immersing themselves in cyberspace, they find their own limit experiences at the border with a whole new kind of other, virtuality itself. Their transformation, their unlocking, happens in the digital realm.
So let's just recap that. We've got 3 totally different paths to transformation, right? One person seeks union with a higher being. Another explores their own inner self. And a third inhabits the digital frontier. What this model is really suggesting is that we're not just one kind of human. We can exist and find our potential in completely different ways, on completely different borders. So, at the end of the day, what's the big takeaway here? It's this. Our identity isn't some fixed thing buried deep at our core. It's the dynamic potential that we discover right at the very edge of our own experience. In other words, who you are isn't just who you are right now. It's defined by who you are becoming.
Ultimately, what this view tells us is that being human isn't about finding some single, static essence. It's a dynamic, ongoing process. A process of unlocking ourselves at all the different borders of our lives. And honestly, it's a vision of identity that feels so much more true to the complex, multifaceted world we all live in today.
So, if we accept this idea, if being human is really a process of unlocking, then that leaves us with one last good question. And this one is for you. What border are you exploring right now? And what are you opening yourself up to?